Are we live? We are now. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Before we do anything, I got to tell you about some changes that are coming up. If you've been looking carefully at the background here, you might notice that my bookshelf is empty. That's because I got some pretty big changes coming up in my life, and as a result, after this one, I'm going to be taking 1 or 2 weeks off, but we will be back. The big change, as far as you're concerned, is going to be the time. I know we have been doing this pretty consistently on Mondays at noon Eastern Standard Time. That's going to be changing. I'm going to be changing this to Thursdays at noon Eastern Standard Time. For those of you who can't join us on Thursdays, I'm so sorry. My life circumstances changed a little bit. Thursday just makes way more sense for me. If you can't join us live anymore, I understand. You're still more than welcome to check out the recorded version. And maybe for some of you who watch the recorded versions of this, maybe you can hang out a little bit on Thursdays, and I'd love to talk with you while I'm doing these things. So be on the lookout for that in the near future. All right. Last time we were talking about a section of the Bible that I don't really have a better name for than just the Luke 12 sermon. Luke makes it pretty clear that this is all within one particular sermon that Jesus says these things, but he doesn't we don't have a nice pretty word for it like we do, say, the Sermon on the Mount. That's the sermon that we find in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Here, you don't really see anything like it. We do know the context of it. The context and the overarching theme of this particular sermon is beware the leaven of the Pharisees. So unlike the Sermon on the Mount, which is really about a personal responsibility, this one, while still being about personal responsibility, is dealing with negative influences that might cause corruption. We've seen that Jesus has told them to have no fear. That also tells us that this one seems to be directed more towards his established disciples. Not necessarily the 12, but his established disciples, whereas the Sermon on the Mount was really more towards a generalized audience. He's been talking about the necessity of confessing him before others. And then we also saw the parable of the rich fool. That was when somebody in the crowd told Jesus to make his brother give him what he owes him. And Jesus takes the opportunity to instead talk about being overly concerned with earthly riches. I suppose the person in question was not too happy about that, but that's what he does. So we're going to go ahead and end the Luke 12 sermon now. And one of the things you're probably going to notice is a lot of the things we see in this sermon from this point on are things we have already seen earlier in our study of the life of Christ. So let me go ahead and preempt that right now, as far as any criticism towards the Bible that might come from that. It's entirely possible that Jesus said the same thing multiple times. You'll see, for example, in this next section, you might recognize it from the Sermon on the Mount. It's almost exactly what Matthew records. Luke just changes the order a little bit. And you might say, well, there you go. There's contradiction in the Bible. Luke has this happening here in response to the Pharisees, whereas Matthew has it happening on the Sermon on the Mount. And by the way, they get things a little bit out of order. But no, how on earth are we going to eliminate the possibility that Jesus just said the same thing multiple times? You know, if you follow just about any preacher carefully, you'll probably recognize certain patterns that they have. I certainly have a lot of patterns. There's a lot of things that I have said multiple times, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, when you get into the habit of preaching, you tend to get into this groove. And it's not like you get this complete hard reset from sermon to sermon. Some ideas still tend to stick with you for a while. Two, repetition is a good thing. Repetition is the key to learning. Almost anything difficult to learn that you've ever had to learn in your life, you probably had it repeated to you. How did you learn your alphabet? By continually repeating probably the song, right? That's how you learn it. So Jesus was just being a good teacher if he's teaching the same thing multiple times here. And then again, we must also consider that this might be a different audience than from before. And so it might be time to teach the same thing with a slight change in order to deal with this particular audience. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the things that he did teach. And he said to his disciples, by the way, this is Luke chapter 12, verse 22, and he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, about your body, what you will put on, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are they than the birds? Are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow, they neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat, what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. So again, if you're very familiar with the Sermon on the Mount, you should be familiar with this passage. You might recall that we went over almost this exact phrasing from Matthew chapter 6. There is a little bit of a difference. In Matthew chapter 6, for example, Jesus doesn't say consider the ravens. He says consider the birds of the air. All right, very clearly, it's still basically the same idea. Jesus says that we ought not be overly anxious. In a very similar way to how this is well transitioned in the Sermon on the Mount, this is also well transitioned in the Luke 12 sermon. When you look at the context back in Matthew chapter 6. Well, let's see here. It starts, Matthew chapter 6, for example, starts with being able to give to the needy. He transitions that into how you ought to pray, because when he's talking about giving to the needy, he says, don't do it like the hypocrites do it. Don't do it so that you can receive honor from men. And using that same theme of receiving honor from men, he then talks about praying. Don't pray so that you receive honor from men. And then he talks about, within that prayer, forgiving others their trespasses. He then goes into fasting. Again, don't do it so you receive honor from men. So using this theme of focusing on what you are getting in a spiritual sense instead of a physical sense, he then is going to talk about the general idea above all of that, which is laying up your treasures in heaven. You should be focusing, your investments ought to be spiritual, because any physical investment you make, by the way, he's not saying that there's something wrong with ever having any amount of money, but loving it and placing your hope on it, that's a problem. So, he says, focus on that which is above, that which cannot be destroyed, which is when he starts talking about laying up your treasures in heaven. And from that transitions into not being anxious. If your treasures are laid up in heaven, then you're not going to be anxious about the things of this earth. Notice, by the way, that he's speaking in general truths. Again, Matthew chapter 6 here is almost exactly how we read in Luke chapter 12. He says that God makes sure that the birds get fed. Now, is he saying that there has never been a bird that starved to death? Obviously not. He says that God makes sure that the grass blooms. Has there ever been a bad year in which the grass did not bloom? Of course there has. He's not saying that it's impossible that you are ever going to suffer through hardship. But he says, don't worry about it. The birds aren't worried about it. The grass isn't worried about it. And generally speaking, God takes pretty good care of them, doesn't he? And if you really have the right perspective, if you really understand what you ought to, you're going to understand that God has still given me what I need, even if he's not giving me food, even if he's not giving me clothing. Is that difficult? Of course it is. But it is the truth. So that's the context in the Sermon on the Mount, and part of the reason I believe that Jesus says essentially the same thing in two different contexts is because the transition is also absolutely masterful in Luke chapter 12. What were we talking about before? The parable of the rich fool. This man dies and loses his soul because he is anxious and worried about gaining more and more riches here on earth. Jesus says, just like he said before, your anxiousness is completely unmerited. And then I mentioned that it's out of order. Then he's going to mention laying up your treasures of heaven. So in the Sermon on the Mount, he started off laying up your treasures in heaven and then talked about being anxious. Here, he talks about being anxious and then gives that bit about laying up your treasures in heaven. Fear not, this is verse 32 of Luke 12. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags and do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail. I'm sorry, let me reread that real quick. Provide yourself with money bags that do not grow old, and with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The phrasing here is a little bit different from the Sermon on the Mount, but very clearly he's talking about the same thing. It's just more succinct in Luke's account. Place your hope in the heavenly treasures, money bags that are not destroyed. He's talking about those heavenly treasures. Where your hope is, your heart, or where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Okay, let's continue. Verse 35. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their masters to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks. Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will dress himself for service and have them recline at a table, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the second watch or in the third and finds them awake, blessed are those servants. But know this, that if the master of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have left his house to be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. So I actually went a little bit further than I intended here, but that's fine. This section does not, to my knowledge, have an exact parallel in any of the other Gospels. However, the first part, about the servants of the master being ready, is extremely similar to the parable of the wise and foolish virgins we find in Matthew chapter 25. Obviously, here he's talking about male servants, and here he's groomsmen, and over there he's talking about virgins. So you might think bridesmaids. And did he even say? Let me check something real quick. Yeah, so it is still both about a wedding feast. That's the parable that's being set up here. Again, this is Jesus teaching the same concept in slightly different ways. He probably gave this parable a couple of times. He probably gave most of the parables multiple times. And so here's the parable. At least let's look at what Matthew says in chapter 25. We'll get back to this when we get to that actual parable in our generalized way of doing it. But here's the essence of it, is being prepared. Remember, in the virgins, those who were ready and had bought themselves enough oil, they were allowed into the wedding feast. Those who, when they saw the master coming, tried to go and buy the oil, they weren't allowed into the wedding feast. They weren't prepared. So the idea here is to be prepared. And again, the idea from here afterwards is, if the master of the house knows when the thief is coming, he's going to prepare himself for that time. But since you don't know when the thief is coming, the best thing to do is to prepare at all times. And again, this last one is also, it's also along that theme of being prepared at all times. Verse 41. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants, and to eat and to drink and to get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at that hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand more. Okay. Again, we have some small reference here. This seems very similar to the parable of the talents, which we haven't covered in its entirety yet. We'll get there when we get there. But it all is within the same theme, which is being prepared at all times. The parable of the talents seems to be emphasizing a different part of that parable, whereas this one, where Jesus says you have a servant who is either ready or he is not, it seems to be more along the lines of generally being ready, whereas the parable of the talents more emphasizes the use of what is being invested. Okay, but all three of these parables, and to review very quickly, you have one where you have servants of the bridegroom who are ready to allow him into the wedding feast even if he is delayed. That's the first one. You have a man who is preparing for thieves to potentially break into his house. And then the third one is you have a servant whose master has gone away on a trip and he doesn't know when he's coming back. The theme with each one is being prepared. I think the last one is best for us when we're trying to understand what the meaning of this is. If you know the exact time in which you might be held accountable for something, then you might start doing what is right, not out of the overflow of your heart, but just because, hey, this is when I can get away with it. If, for example, every person knew exactly when they would die or when the Lord came back, I suspect many people would just, okay, I'll be evil right up until that point where I can get away with being good. And that certainly isn't the point. You ever wonder why it is that we don't know exactly when Jesus is going to come back? I know a lot of people say they know exactly when Jesus is coming back. They are wrong. They are absolutely wrong. In fact, if there is ever a time that Jesus won't be coming back, I expect it will be on those days in which many people think that the world is about to end. There have been countless people who have predicted the end of the world or when Jesus is going to come back exactly, and they haven't been right once. Don't listen to those people. Jesus made it very clear. I'm intentionally not coming back at a time you expect it. Why? Because then people would turn from the wrath. Not because they want to repent towards God, but because they want to cheat their way into heaven, essentially. That doesn't work. In this last parable, you have a servant who is treating his fellow servants cruelly. And if he knew exactly when the master would come back, it would be all, oh, I'll clean everything up. And when he comes back, it will look like he received exactly what he had asked for. But that is not the truth. And so Jesus is clearly saying here, don't be like this. Peter asked if this is for us alone or is it for all? I think by this response we find out pretty clearly this is for all. This is also partially why you have some of the language from the parable of the talents, because a minor theme in the parable of the talents and in here as well is the idea that you can't start comparing the works that God has done through you to the works that God has done through somebody else and potentially start resting on your laurels. Right? In the parable of the talents, you have a 5-talent man and then you have a 2-talent man. The 5-talent man is expected to come back with 10 talents. The 2-talent man is expected to come back with 4 talents. In other words, God does not expect necessarily the same results of his workers from all time because he recognizes not everybody gets the exact same starting point. You might be like me and you feel like you're an extremely good starting point. I was very blessed, for example, in my upbringing. if a person is abused in their upbringing, or they are led very far away from Christ, I don't think that person is expected to produce as much. Sometimes they do, but I don't think they're quite expected to produce as much as those who are very close to Christ in their upbringing. As far as I can tell, there are two reasons why somebody's upbringing would be brought very close to Christ. Reason number one, they are expected to do a lot with it. Or reason number two, is because God knew that they were just so stubborn that they wouldn't get it unless it was made this easy for them. My solution to this problem has been this: try to live humbly, as if I'm really so foolish this was the only way I would have ever obtained any sort of salvation. But in action, act as though a lot of it is expected of me. And that's how we should all act, as though much is expected of us. That's the point we see here. Okay. Next section, verse 49. I came to cast on the earth, I cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For from now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. There will be divided father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Again, we have seen this before. You can find Jesus saying almost exactly this in Matthew chapter 10. He says this in verses 34 through 39. And again, it's almost the same thing. We also find out that this is in accordance with the Old Testament. This is prophecy fulfillment. This is what the prophet Micah in chapter 7, verse 6 said about the Messiah. Now, when Jesus says, I didn't come to bring peace on the earth, he does not indicate that he is not a fan of peace. But one, there's an immediate understanding that we should have of this, which is that it is not the Christian's job to bring about physical world peace. If we think that our goal is to create heaven on earth, which unfortunately many apostasies do claim that that's what the Christians ought to be doing, we are sorely mistaken. One of the big points of the Old Testament is that trying to create heaven on earth, and if there was ever a nation that could have done that, it would have been the Old Testament Israelites. And if you're very familiar with the history of the Old Testament Israelites, you might think that such a statement is insane, but there has never been a nation that was better set up to create heaven on earth than Old Testament Israel. And if they failed so spectacularly, we should know that it just cannot be done. That's the immediate idea. But when Jesus says, I've come to cast fire on earth, or I've come to bring division, he doesn't mean that he desires for these things, but he knows that his actions are going to cause it. Sometimes we worry about Christianity being divisive, and we believe we should not preach anything divisive whatsoever. Woe to us if we believe that, because Jesus certainly was willing to preach divisive things. He didn't want people to be divided, but he knew the truth would divide people. This is what he's talking about. And he knows that even, yes, within our families, there will be division caused by the word of God. I've known many people who have had to essentially lose family members because they have heard the truth of the gospel and they were no longer willing to participate in lies. I've also known people who were not willing, even though they knew the truth of the gospel, they were not willing to obey it because of the division it would cause in their family. Jesus said, whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves mother or father more than me. Any human relationship that is a priority to you above Jesus, Jesus says, that one is not worthy of me. Now here's the good news. Having a strong relationship with Jesus is such a great way to have a strong relationship with everybody else. And if that relationship with Jesus causes division, you can rest assured knowing that you're not the problem here. There are very few times in our relationships when we can be so confident. Okay. This one should sound very familiar with it, because we've only very recently mentioned it. It was in Matthew chapter 16. But in verse 54, he says, "He also said to the crowds, 'When you see a cloud rising in the west, you say a shower is coming, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be a scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time?'" You might recall that in Matthew's account, and it's very much in the same context that Luke chapter 12 shows up, in reference to the Pharisees demanding a sign, Jesus made reference to being able to interpret the weather. He says it a little bit differently. He talks, the old sailor's rhyme is essentially what Jesus does. Obviously, the English rhyme came later. But remember, red sky in morning, sailors take warning. Red sky at night, sailors delight. This one, he says essentially the same thing. He says, when you look out in the morning and you see that it's red, you know that there's a storm coming. And if you see it's red at evening, you know that there will be clear weather, which is generally true, by the way. Here he uses a couple of different examples. He says, if you see a cloud in the west, you know that it's going to storm. Or if you feel a wind from the south, you know that it is going to be very hot. That one is a lot more specific to his geographical region, but it's also generally true. Do we have a contradiction here? Did Matthew say in this context Jesus said one thing and that Luke said another thing, both about weather? Absolutely not. Here's the easy answer to it. Jesus said all of those things. It just so happens that Matthew included these ones, and then Luke included these ones. That's not a contradiction. It's supplementation. But yeah, again, this is all within the context of the Pharisees saying, show us a sign. You already have the sign, is what he's saying. All right, last one. Verse 57. Why do you not judge for yourselves what is right? As you go with your accuser before the magistrate, make an effort to settle with him on the way, lest he drag you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and the officer put you in prison. I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the very last penny. This is from, if this sounds familiar to you from our study, that's because this was also in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. And this is within, as you may recall, one of my most studied sections of the Bible, the antitheses. This is the part where he's talking about anger. Remember what Jesus said? You have heard that it was said, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to the judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother is in danger of the hell of fire. Right? Well, after this, he says in verse 23, so if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. I think there's a little bit of insight here, and honestly, to me, this is one of the strongest cases that you have Jesus repeating certain ideas throughout the entirety of his ministry, because I always thought this was a little bit awkward. I'm following pretty well where he's going with this idea with anger, right? If there's a follow-up almost every single time in the antitheses when he tells you, but I say unto you, and then he goes a little bit further explaining an example of what it ought to look like when you're trying to apply this. And so his example of that is, listen, think in your mind it is more important that I be reconciled to my brother, even than I worship God. He's not saying it's not important to worship God. He says it's even more important to treat your brother with in a godly manner. But then I thought it was always awkward that he added in this little bit about settling quickly with your accuser. But then if you have certain phrases and ideas that Jesus uses multiple times throughout the ministry, then it starts to make a little more sense. If this is something he wants to get in several sermons, this is a decent point to put in here. And again, it's a little less awkward in the Luke 12 sermon, but it's the exact same point, which is not only am I going to be trying to settle with those whom I have conflict with, I should try to settle quickly. And he gives a very practical example in this case, which is, look, you want to stay out of prison, then try to settle conflicts quickly with people who have legal the legal right to cause you to go to prison, right? Or have some sort of revenge on you. But obviously, he's not just talking about those circumstances. In all things, be quick to settle with your accuser. Okay. That is the Luke chapter 12 sermon, and that is going to start a break for us. Again, we should be back in a couple of weeks, and our new time is Thursdays at noon. And I really hope to see you there. Until then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.